to the sixth blessing in the Amidah. Slach lana v'nikichatanu. Forgive us, our Father, for we have sinned. Machal lana malkenu ki fasha'anu. Pardon us, our King, for we have transgressed. Ki mochel v'selech ata. Because you pardon and you forgive. Baruch atah Hashem chanun hamarbeh lisloach. Blessed the one who repeatedly forgives. So, in terms of the natural sequence, after one has prayed to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the penny might drop, and the realization might kind of enter into one's mind that maybe there's something that is actually preventing me from coming close. Maybe there's an interposition. Maybe there's something that's actually got in the way of our relationship. Maybe I actually haven't done everything that he would like me to do, and maybe therefore, when I ask to be close to him, he's going to turn around and say, "What have you done for me lately?" Yeah. So it is quite natural, therefore, that following on a prayer in which we ask to return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the very next prayer should be one in which we ask for slicha, for forgiveness. Well, before we come to the very interesting language in this prayer, I want to ask two very fundamental questions. The first one was really asked to me a number of years ago, and when I was asked it, I was kind of like stumped. It was a member of our congregation who said, I really don't understand why we have to have all this forgiveness stuff in Judaism. Like I'm always sinning. I don't want to walk around in the world thinking that I'm sinning. I'd much prefer to have a more upbeat, kind of buoyant sort of relationship. I mean, after all, I'm not a bad person. I'm not going around, doing terrible things and murdering people and things like that. And to have to stand up 3 times a day, for goodness sake, and then you've got this whole big Rosh Hashanah and Kippur business. It makes me feel, he said, as if the whole of Judaism is just one big guilt trip, and I've got to keep apologizing, for myself. And it's a bad headspace. It's not a good place for a person to be in life. It's the wrong kind of approach. So why then do we have all of this slach lanu and forgiveness and everything else? Which was a very nice question. The second question is actually a little bit, in a sense, more difficult to answer. When you're asking God to forgive me, Lord, because I have sinned, who are you trying to kid? You're going to change? Between now and Mincha, when you're going to say this prayer again for a second time. And then between Mincha and Mariv, when you're going to say for the third time, you really think that anything is going to change? So you're standing before the Almighty and you are saying words which you simply don't mean. Slach lanu. What do you really want to be? What are you asking God to forgive you for? If there's no genuine sense of having done anything wrong, to the point where you, as a consequence of having asked God to forgive you, I'm now going to go out and start with a clean sheet. I'm going to make my life different. From now on, after I've asked for forgiveness, I'm going to change my life. I'm going to do what he wants me to do. And yet that you're going to say salach lanu, and then you're going to go back to whatever your standard is in Judaism. Supposing you're a little bit kind of like wishy-washy when it comes to kashrut, and to eating and things like that. So, you've davened mincha, but you're meeting somebody for lunch somewhere, where you're going to be eating fish out, or whatever it is. Yeah. So what's the meaning of this prayer? Apart from anything else, we have a principle that is laid down by Maimonides and by others in the Talmud, that a person who says, you know what, echter, I will sin v'ashuv, because I know that I can always repent afterwards, that person's repentance is actually not accepted, because it's under false pretenses. You never intended, you're just using God's good grace as an excuse for your bad behavior. I will sin, I'll do whatever I want, but I know it's okay. God's pretty good up over there. He's going to come to arrangement with me, and he's going to forgive me. So this whole prayer over here, in one respect, is the most problematic prayer of all the prayers of the Amidah, because it is so discordant with our own behavior. I can perfectly well understand that when a person says, Rafa'enu Hashem v'nei rafei, the next blessing, heal me, O Lord, and let me be healed. Oh, yes, I'm genuine about that. Yeah, I mean that one. And when you come to the next one about parnasa, give me appropriate parnasa, I really mean that one. Oh yes, I'm into that one. Except, when I come to Jerusalem and things like that, I can mean that as well. But salach lanu, forgive me, when I have no intention of changing the way in which I live. So those are the two fundamental questions that I face, that I raise in regard to this, even before you come to the language of it. So let's deal with the first question for today, and perhaps we'll try and tackle the second one tomorrow. The issue that was raised about how we have this kind of like heavy duty sort of number sitting on us about sin and sin and sin. And I think it's, let me ask this question in an entirely different context. A Reform Jew drives up to shul on Shabbat and parks his car directly outside the shul, because in his interpretation of Judaism, it's perfectly permitted to drive a car on Shabbat. An Orthodox Jew of our kind of communities drives his car to shul on Shabbat and parks around the corner, because the interpretation of the religion says you're not permitted to drive a car on Shabbat. Is one a hypocrite? Is there any difference between the two? Is the Reformed Jew being just more honest? And why doesn't the Orthodox Jew simply acknowledge and admit that I'm doing something which is wrong? So the Orthodox Jew has actually arrived at a sort of a deal with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we all do. We all make our deals. He understands me. We've got an understanding between God and me. I'm not so religious. I'm religious because I want to go to shul and Shabbat, but I'm not sugar frum, okay? So for me, I found an excuse, a way in which I can drive to shul. It doesn't bother me that much. But there's one important thing about that Jew. He knows that there's a gold standard in Judaism, in Orthodox Judaism, that says driving is wrong. And the fundamental difference between the one and the other person is, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe once pointed out very perceptively, that for the one, there's no possibility of change and growth from what he's doing, and for the other, there is. Because for the person who says this is 100% permitted, there's nowhere else to go. For the one who says, I know somewhere at some level that this is not permitted, but it's not where I'm up to, that's not my life, that's not my kind of comfort zone, something could change in that person's life, and they know at least that there is a gold standard, which somewhere at some level inside of them they know they've fallen short of. It doesn't bother them that much, not enough to make them change, but they know that it's there. And I think that there is a kind of like gold standard in all of our lives in terms of not just the performance of mitzvot, what you do and what you don't do. How many of the 248 positive ones you get a tick next to, and how many of the 365 negative ones you're able to say, I didn't do that. But even in terms of the expectation of what is expected of me as a human being, in terms of my refinement, in terms of my compassion, in terms of my goodness, in terms of the effort I make in the world to create a better space, all the things that God expected of me when he created me, dropped a soul into my body and said, here you are, off you go. I'm giving you 70 years, 80 years, please God, 120 years, go off, do your thing. I'm putting an environment. Now let's see what you can do with your life. And which one of us could, hand on heart, say, I fulfilled my entire potential. I have met the standards that the Almighty expected of me when he created me as a Jew, as a human being. So there always has to be some sense that there's a gold standard somewhere which is beyond where I am. And it has to be a sense of the humility to know, God, you know what, I'm not there, but I just ask your forgiveness that I have not fulfilled my potential as a human being yet. Slach lanu, Avinu. Please forgive me, my Father. I have not lived up to all of your expectations. Machal lanu. And we'll have to understand why we've got two languages and why it says chatanu and then pashanu, etc., which we'll come to. But that's the way I read this over here, not as something which is a heavy burden that one has to carry on one's shoulders with this incredible sense of daily guilt, but rather a sense of, Abraham Tversky put it beautifully. He said, the way in which his father educated them as children, his father was a great Rebbe, so he never denigrated them. He never told them, you're a bad boy, you've done something wrong. Instead, what he said to them was, es passt nicht. It's not appropriate for somebody like you to have behaved like that. Implicit in that was an expectation that the child could be so much more. And the disappointment of the parent is that you have not fulfilled your potential yet. It gives you a sense that the father has set an expectation for me, and I'm upset that I've not reached it, that I haven't been able to connect with that. And I think that's the context within which one has to look at Salach Lanu in this prayer here. It's just an interpretation. I'm not telling you something which I've read anywhere, etc. It's just the way I've tried to answer the question, that very difficult question that was put to me. And tomorrow we have to look at the second question as to whether we're just being totally hypocritical and asking God to forgive us, all the time, 3 times a day, when actually it sounds just a bit like lip service, because we're not really going to change, are we? But that's and then we say it the second time at Mincha, and we say it a third time at Maariv a few minutes later. Forgive us, Almighty, forgive us because we have sinned. And the question I asked was, who are you trying to kid? You're trying to kid yourself? Are you trying to kid God? You have no intention of changing. What you did yesterday, you'll do today. And therefore, is this not a profoundly hypocritical prayer, which ought to be eliminated unless you can say it with genuine meaning and resolve that you actually are going to change something between now and the next prayer. And then, of course, if you fail, you'll ask forgiveness again. But I tried my best. I did everything which I could. And so now I'm asking for forgiveness again. And that's not the way in which we approach this prayer. Instead, we say, Slach lana avinu, and then we finish our davening and we go and do exactly what we did yesterday. So that's the problem. And I left the question unanswered yesterday for 2 reasons. First of all, because we'd run out of time. And second of all, because I didn't know the answer. So I've been thinking about it overnight. And I want to suggest to you that there are, by way of an answer, that actually there are 2 different kinds of slicha, of asking for forgiveness. The one is that some things which we do that we genuinely resolve that we'll never do again. And I just ask for forgiveness for that act. We all have things in our lives. I remember, on one occasion when I made my mother, blessed memory, when I made her cry, and I've always regretted it. I'm something I'm sorry for. And I would stand up before the mic and say, Slach lana avinu, forgive me for having done that thing. It would be 100% genuine, because in my heart I've resolved that I would never do such a thing again. To somebody who I loved and cared about and who gave me so much, it was just the wrong thing to do. And so there are things in our lives that we genuinely, when we say Salach lanu, we actually mean it. And we are asking for divine forgiveness for those acts. But there are many, many, many other things in our lives of a different kind of slicha. When we say slach lanu, and I have no intention of changing it. And it doesn't detract from the fact that I am sorry about it. There are lots of things that I'm sorry about that I'm not going to change. I'm really sorry that I've not been able to keep up with Daf Yomi, studying a page of Talmud a day. I'm sorry about it. But I know that practically speaking, in the course of my life at the moment, it's not something I'm going to be able to do. So I'm sorry about it, but I'm going to continue to do it. I'm sorry about the fact that I never learned French. Really, I'm sorry. But I'm not going to learn French now, or Chinese or something else. It doesn't stop me from being sorry. And so when I stand up before the Almighty and I say, Slach lana, forgive me, Lord, because the things which I do that I'm not making a blessing before I eat your food or a blessing after I've eaten the food. I'm taking things in this world without your permission or whatever it is. What you're really saying is actually, I am sorry about it, but given where I am, given my whole environment, given the way in which I live, those are not things which I'm going to actually be able to change at this point of time. The important thing is that actually it remains, in some sense or another, aspirational. When I say slach lanu, it means that I actually do hope at some level that I would be able to do those things. It's just not going to happen now. And therefore, I don't think that is a hypocritical statement. On the contrary, it's probably an honest statement, because it's acknowledging who I am, where my shortfalls are, the limitations of my own spirituality and my own commitment or whatever else it is. And I'm simply saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you know what, God, I'm sorry. Really, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. You understand who I am. You understand, secular world in which I live. I seek your understanding for this, and I seek your forgiveness for it, even though you know and I know that at this point in time, I'm not going to change these things, but I still want to change these things at some level. And in a sense, I suppose it's a question of who is praying, my mouth or my soul? If it is my soul, then of course my soul is sorry, because my soul wants to be connected with God, and connection comes by fulfilling his commandments. If it's just my mouth, then it doesn't matter. I can say anything I like, because I don't really mean it. So I think that when we stand up and we daven the Amidah, we're davening not just with our mouth, we're davening aspirationally with our souls as well. And therefore it's fine to say, Slach lana Avinu, and to say, but I also know, and you know, that between now and Mincha, not a lot is going to change. That's what I offer to you as a realistic and a pragmatic approach to this prayer. So we need to actually look at some of the words over here, because we have the two forms of sin over here. One is called, as I read the prayer over here, Slach lana Avinu, forgive us, O Lord, ki chatanu, because we have sinned. And then we say, Machal lana, pardon us, O King, ki fashanu, for we have transgressed. So what is the fundamental difference between a chet and a pesha? These are terms which come up in Yom Kippur davening as well. They are subtle differences between types of sins. In general terms, the word chet actually has a biblical connotation of having missed the mark. We find in the story of Jonathan and David, when he shoots the arrow, that the arrow misses the mark. So a chet, what we call in English sin, which is a very generalized word, which has a Christian connotation for us rather than a Jewish one. So one needs to actually look at the Hebrew word itself. A chet means I've missed the mark. There was something that I was aiming for and I fell short of it. My arrow fell short or beyond it or whatever. And in that sense, therefore, chet means something which was actually just inadvertent. And it's an inadvertent sin. Forgive me for my inadvertent sins, the things I've done really by mistake, where I simply missed the mark in life. I knew what I was aiming for, but I didn't quite get there. That's fine. And pesha refers to a sin that is an absolute intentional, something which I just decided I was going to do. That's it. I knew it was wrong, but it didn't bother me, and I did it. So that's a pesha. And that's why in this prayer over here, we find a subtle difference between the first part of the prayer and the second part of the prayer. Slach lanu Avinu, forgive us, our Father, ki chatanu, because I have inadvertently sinned. Machal lanu malkeinu, pardon me, our King, because pashanu. When it is a question of I've simply made an error, I have not reached the mark, I have not managed to live up to expectations, my expectations, as well as yours, we refer to God as our Father. because that's the kind of relationship you have with the Father when you fall short of the expectations. But if it's a matter of rebellion, that's a different matter altogether. That is something where you've rebelled not against the Father, but you've rebelled against the King. And so therefore, if it's a chatanu, it's slach lanu avinu. And if it is pashanu, it is slach lanu umachal lanu malkeinu. The next point to ask over here, therefore, is that if slicha is, if chet is lighter than a pesha, why then, as the prayer continues, does it then put ki mochel v'salech ata? It has started by talking about slicha because it's lighter, slach lanu avinu ki chatanu, and then it goes on to say machal lanu malkenu ki pashanu, because that's more serious. And the very next phrase it says ki mochel v'salech ata, because you mochel first, which is the bigger one for pesha, and soleach, and you forgive, which is the lighter one for chet, second. So we've reversed it within the space of a single phraseology over here. And the answer to that must be quite simple. Is because for the Almighty to forgive us for something which is more serious is a bigger achievement than to forgive us for something which is inadvertent. Okay. What's the fundamental difference between the idea of a slicha, of a slicha and a mechila? Slach lanu avinu and mechal lanu malkenu. We translate over here slicha as forgive us, and we translate the word mechila as pardon us. Are those adequate English words? And if they are, then what is the difference between being forgiven and being pardoned? And just one more question. Why, if mechila, which is for the more serious transgressions, if that is the bigger forgiveness, why then, when we end this blessing, do we simply end with Chanun Hamarbe Lisloach, the one who graciously forgives us, and there's no mention over here of Mechila, which is a bigger forgiveness? Why do we end the blessing with just one of these terms when throughout the entire blessing we've been talking about both of them? So you've got two dynamics over here. One is called Slicha, one is called Mechila. We need to understand their differences and why we end with Slicha and not with Mechila. All of that is still to come. In trying to understand the meaning of the word Mechila. So we have two words over here in our prayer, Slicha and Mechila. Of course, on Yom Kippur, we add another one called Kapara, which we normally translate as atonement. But in our daily prayers, it is either slicha or mechila. And what is the difference between the two? So slicha is, in a sense, an easier one because it appears throughout the Bible. And interestingly enough, it appears always in the context of divine forgiveness. It is never the forgiveness between two human beings of one form or another, which is very odd because in modern Hebrew, we have taken something from a biblical nature which has had one particular context, and we've used the same word to apply it in an entirely new and different context, because in modern Hebrew, of course, slicha means excuse me to another person. Slicha, excuse me, forgive me, or whatever. So we've taken it from the divine and put it into the, you know, the story of this person who wanted to do it, was doing a survey around the world. There was a terrible meat shortage, you know, around the world. And he wanted to see if there was a difference in attitude between people in different countries towards this terrible shortage. So he started off in Russia, and he said, excuse me, sir, he was going to ask the same question. What is your view on the meat shortage? And the Russian said to him, what's meat? Then he went to America and he said, excuse me, sir, what do you think of the meat shortage? And the American says to him, what's a shortage? And then he goes to Israel and he says, excuse me, sir, what do you think of the meat shortage? And the Israeli says to him, what's this, excuse me? So slicha, nevertheless, is something which happens in a human context. So that's slicha, that's easy enough. Mechila is a lot more difficult because mechila doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. We find it only in Mishnaic and Talmudic contexts, and it's never 100% clear in terms of exactly what it means. And so one needs to go back to its roots, and this is one of those words which, as Danny has been so patiently explaining to us, in the name of his mother, may she live for many years, is a word which opens itself to a number of different meanings. And the first one is the possibility that it comes from the word halal, which means an open space. Like you have the word for flute in Hebrew, which is a khalil, because it has openings and spaces and the air comes out of it. A window is called a chalon because it allows it's an opening. Chala might come from the same word as well, because historically in biblical times, challah in ancient Middle Eastern was probably a bit like a pita with a hollow center, a bit like a bagel. So it would also have this idea of openness. So it's possible, therefore, that mechila comes from this root of halal, in which case mechila, very fascinatingly, means an open space. An open space in the sense that whatever was between us has now disappeared. There's an open space, an openness now between us, which is a very interesting way to understand mechila. Nevertheless, that's not its favored interpretation. It's the Aramaic root of the word chet lamed, lamed, is actually to forgive or to relinquish. So if it is a word which has an Aramaic root, then you'll see it as forgiveness. There is a third possibility, which is just looking at its context in Tanakh, that the word mechila might mean to erase or to blot out or to remove or to wipe away. And there are people in the Tanakh who have this name, like Machal. You know, that was the wife of Michal, the wife of King David. And when you have a word like Machla, the daughter of Tzlafchad, or Machlat, the daughter of Esau, it could be argued that the word Mechila actually did exist in biblical times, and it might have meant a musical instrument or dancing, because you're not going to call somebody forgiveness. If you're going to give them a name like Machlat, it's going to be somebody who's joyous and dances and things like that. So here are some of the variations. Very interestingly, support for the idea that Mechila actually means forgiveness comes from archaeology. There is a place called Tel Lachash, which is in about 9 kilometers south of Kiryat Gat in Israel, in the southern part of the country. It's adjacent to kibbutz or moshav Lachash, and there's a very, very ancient mound there, which has been the subject of great excavation. And in this mound, or in this dig, they have found the remains of an altar, which is dated from the 5th century BCE, which would be the later biblical period. And on this altar, the presumption is that it belonged to a Jew. And in those days, a Jew could have their own, you could have your own altar. And the name on the altar is Machlia, which means something which presumably means that an altar was named God's forgiveness, which is what an altar would be doing. And so therefore, in this context, we presume that the word mechila is in some way or another related to forgiveness. But what is the precise relationship between slicha, which we're calling forgiveness, and mechila, which we also, in some sense or another, calling forgiveness? So there are a number of different suggestions in regard to this. One is that slicha means I'm going to say sorry for what I did, and mechila is going to be translated as, and I'm going to wipe away the memory of it. In other words, I forgive you, but it's still kind of like hanging around. Yeah, okay, I've forgiven you, but it's still a bone in my throat, you know, it still nudges me every time I think about it. It irritates me. But I have forgiven you. Okay. But it's still hanging around. And mechila means I'm going to get rid of it completely. Psychologically, it's not there anymore. And that would be one way of distinguishing between the two. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch has an interesting interpretation of the two of them in his Sidur. And he says that Slicha is something about personal forgiveness. It's the psychological relationship between the two of us, that I forgive you and I forgive you entirely. Mechila then is something of a slightly more objective nature. It's the waiver of the punishment. In other words, if, for example, I throw a pie onto your dress or onto your suit, there's two things which have to happen in order to make things right. One is I have to say sorry, and that's about the relationship between you and me, so that I can clear the air and continue with our relationship going forward. And the second is I have to pay for dry cleaning. There's a cost over here. So you turn around and say, no, don't worry about the dry cleaning. I'll pay for it. It's a waiver. Okay. So slicha is forgiveness, and mechila is the waiver of or whatever price you have to pay for this, whatever punishment is required for this particular sin. And that's a nice way to put it. At any rate, just to finish this subject off in this blessing, as I mentioned yesterday, we end with Chanun Hamarbe Lisloach, the one who graciously continues to provide slicha, and when there's no mention of mechila. And the question is, why is mechila left out, and why is it slicha that is emphasized in this blessing? And I shall illustrate it with a story. It's about the fellow who's suddenly becomes bereaved, and his yahrzeit is on the Shabbat each year. As he comes to shul only once a year, and it's on the Shabbat when we read the story of Joseph being thrown into prison. So this fellow is sitting in shul and is unfamiliar with the whole Bible. He only comes to shul. This is the first time he's coming to shul, and the first time he's ever heard the story. And he's sitting over there, and his neighbor notices that he's crying. So he turns around and says, "Tell me, why are you crying?" He says, "This is just such a terribly sad story. I can't believe it. Here's a young man who's completely innocent, and a terrible injustice has been done. What this woman has done to him, Potiphar's wife. The fact that this young boy of 17 is being thrown into a pit. It's a terrible place. And I just feel so terribly, terribly sorry for him." So his neighbor says to him, "Look," he said, "don't worry about it." He said, "Next week he comes out of prison. It's going to be okay, I'll tell you." A year later, the fellow comes back to shul again hasn't been to shul the entire year, and he's sitting over there. He's sitting next to the same neighbor, same person in shul. And once again, his neighbor sees that he's crying. He says, "What's the matter now?" He says, "I can't believe it's happened again." He says, it's unbelievable. A second time, he's being thrown to prison again. So his friend said, "Look," he says, "I'm telling you, it's going to be okay. He's going to get out. I know the end of the story. He's coming out of prison. It's going to be fine." The third year, the fellow's sitting there, and he's absolutely fuming. There's smoke coming out of his nose, out of his ears. His neighbor turns around him and says, "So what's the problem now?" He says, "I'm telling you, I'm really angry with this young man." He says, "For something like this to happen once, okay, it was a mistake. Something happened, it was terrible. It happened a second time, okay. But to allow himself to be in this situation 3 times is completely and totally unacceptable. He's no good, this young man. I've changed my view about him, and I'm furious with him." What's happened over here? Somebody irritates you, one of your kids comes and does something naughty, and you forgive them. "Don't do it again." "Okay, Mom, Dad, I won't do it again." And then they do it again. "Okay, I'll forgive you." And they do it the 3rd time. By the time they come to the 4th or 5th time, after all the protestations to say that I'm not going to, I forgive you and I'm not going to do it again, etc., it's beginning to wear a little thin. So your capacity for forgiveness is severely diminished. You get to the point where you say, it's enough. I'm not going to do it anymore. After I had a heart attack 20 years ago, I would visit my cardiologist, who's a wise old owl, And one of the things which happens after heart attacks, apparently quite a common phenomenon, is that when you suffer anxiety and your body kind of recreates the feelings, and in your mind, you begin to think, oh, here we are. It's the same. It's exactly the same things which are happening all over again. I need to be tested. Just go and check that everything's okay. Because to me, it feels like the same symptoms, the tightness of the chest, and the pain and things like that. So every Montag and Donnerstag, every Monday and Thursday, I was running back to the cardiologist in those early weeks of anxiety, say, could you just test again, test again. And every time it just, thank God, just turned out to be, symptoms of anxiety. It happened so many times that I sat in front of him one day and I said, look, I'm really, really sorry. I apologize. I know I'm driving you mad, but, I'm worried and I can't help it. I need to come and test it. And he looked at me and said, you know what, Shlomo? He said, please don't be worried. Don't apologize. I want you to know that every time you sit here and you describe your symptoms to me, it's as if you are a brand new patient who I've never ever heard from before. And I'm listening to your story and to your symptoms with a completely and totally fresh ear, as if there's no history whatsoever. And that's the way in which I'm assessing you. In other words, everything which has come before is completely and totally erased. It's a fresh, brand new story. That's the way I listen to you. That's the way I hear you. And in a sense, that is the essence of this whole prayer. We come before HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Shachrit, and we say, Slach Lanu. I'm not going to do it again. And then you come before him at Mincha, and you say exactly the same thing, and you're forgiven. And you come back at Mariv, and you're forgiven. And day in and day out, and year in and year out, every day you're asking for slicha, and every day, okay, fine, forgiven. Now you're a tzaddik. That's not human. That's why we say this blessing over here, Chanun, by your grace, Hamarbeh Lisloach. You are fulsome in your capacity to forgive, because it is only the divine who can forgive in this kind of way. And that is the beauty and the power of this blessing. And so with that, we'll be ready to move on to the next blessing, which we'll discuss, please God, on Sunday. And so we come to the next blessing, which reads as follows. It has the heading, redemption. Re'eh v'onyenu, look upon our affliction, v'riva rivenu, and plead our cause, ugalenu mehira, l'man shemecha, and redeem us speedily for your name's sake, ki goel chazak ata, because you are a powerful redeemer. Baruch ata Hashem, blessed are you, Lord, Goel Yisrael, the Redeemer of Israel. When you look at this blessing for the first time, you actually don't even know what it's talking about. Because in the context of redemption, there's just so much of it flying around. We enter into the Amidah with a blessing which sounds very similar to this one, other than the fact that the tense has changed. The last blessing, as we step forward to recite the Amidah, and as we know, there should be no interruption between that blessing and the Amidah, is Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, blessed are you, O Lord, who has redeemed Israel. And the passage prior to that has spoken about the Exodus from Egypt and all the other ideas relating to redemption, which is in the past. A little bit later on, further on in the Amidah, we're going to recite a blessing for the ingathering of all the exiles, which in fact will be a future redemption for the entire Jewish nation, a national redemption. So where does this one fit in? As it happens, I don't think that there's actually a blessing that is more relevant, a request from the Almighty in the entire Amidah, which is more relevant in our lives than this one. And the nature of its relevance actually is one which shifts and changes over the period of time, depending on the circumstances of the Jewish people. Because this is not a request for past redemption or for future redemption, but for present redemption. You have to ask the question, what kind of redemption do we need in our present time? Again, it's not about the redemption, messianic redemption, bring the world into a better place. All of that is coming. And neither is it to say thank you for the things which have happened in the past. It's talking about the redemption that we require now in our lives. And if you, at face value, it's hard to think in any way in which we require redemption because, hey, we're leading pretty good lives. What is it, that's stopping you from getting on with your life? And the answer is very little. So we don't need redemption at first glance. So Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, by the way, says that the difference between these two phrases over here, Re'eh v'onyenu, see our affliction, and the second part, V'riva rivenu, and plead our cause, is a difference between those things for which are internal to us. Onyenu means our own personal redemption, and the second part of it are those things which we're asking the Almighty to do for us. So let's just unpack this a little bit. So historically, the redemption we're talking over here is the redemption from personal crises. In other words, imagine Jews in previous times in really, really living in, even at the time when these words were first put together. At the time, I mean, this is the time of the Sanhedrin in Yavne. It's a time of Roman domination. Life is very, very difficult for Jews throughout all the ages of exile. There are going to be circumstances in which Jews are going to find themselves in moments of personal crises in one form or another. And so therefore, historically, what this blessing meant was a plea to the Almighty to release a person from a personal crisis such as captivity or persecution or misfortune or affliction of some form or another. And then the question arises, well, none of that, thank God, actually pertains in our times. So what kind of redemption are we talking about? And why is it that I suggest that this is so intensely relevant to us in our lives? Well, it's a funny kind of thing, but in some respects, although we enjoy the greatest freedom of possibly any time in Jewish history, other than moments such as the Golden Age of Spain and one or two other moments in history, this is a golden age for Jews in the Western world. Notwithstanding that, the world seems to be more personally afflicted today than any other time, and you only need to take a quick look at some of the books on the bookstand in an airport to realize that about 50% of them are going to be about issues relating to the personal hang-ups that people get themselves caught up in their lives. The issues relating to self-improvement, of being able to be successful, in other words, what has come together with the freedom is a kind of imprisonment of our own spirit and of our own minds. And we have become psychologically a great deal more complex. I think about my parents who were came to South Africa impoverished from Lithuania and built a nice middle class kind of life. Their entire lives was dominated by the need to be able to support a family, to create a stable environment. I never ever heard my parents engage in the kind of self-reflectiveness that came for the next generation, when we obsessed at university about how am I feeling today and what is going on in my life and what is happening internally in my own psyche, and my own hang-ups and my own limitations. And we became a very, very self-reflective generation. And together with that self-reflectiveness came a huge amount of internal complexity and dissatisfaction as well. And all of this becomes a deeply, profoundly inhibiting factor in the ability to actually release our souls in order to be able to reach HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in order to be able to move beyond our own sense of insular self and to be able to see beyond ourselves a sense of a spiritual freedom. So the nature of this prayer has changed. And when we talk about Re'eh v'onyenu, see our affliction, we're talking here for many of us about the psychological limitations that prevent us from being able to really connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The complicated intellectual, psychological, emotional worlds within which we live today, and in some way or another which inhibit this spirit to be able to express itself freely. Hence, you'll find Jews, going on taking up yoga and meditation and going on retreats, etc. All because, why are we doing that? Because we're dissatisfied with being a sense of being locked up inside of ourselves. That is the issue that this particular blessing now addresses. And we'll want to look at that further in the next couple of days. We are looking at the blessing in the Amidah. Look upon our affliction, plead our cause, and redeem us soon for your name's sake, because you are a very powerful Redeemer. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, Lord, Goel Israel, who redeems Israel. As I explained yesterday, this is not about redemption in the past or redemption in the future. That is about redemption, which we pray for now in the present. And historically, this might appear, this applies to any kind of impediment which actually prevents us from connecting more fully with God. So it might have been in historic terms issues relating to the circumstances of the Jewish people in captivity or persecution or terrible afflictions. All of that would make just being able to be close to God and to perform his commandments and to live a Jewish life exceptionally difficult. The relevance in our days when all of those kinds of impediments are, thank God, no longer present, we have a different kind of impediment. It's one which is a lot more subtle and internal. It is the fact that there are things which distract us in our emotions and in our minds. I mean, consider the fact that it's so hard because of the pressures of our lives, and we're so rushed that when we stand up to daven the Amidah in the morning, we're hardly even focusing or concentrating on it. We're just reading through the words. By the time you come to this particular blessing, your mind is 100 miles somewhere else. There's no focus on whatsoever. So what we're actually asking from God over here is, Re'ei v'onyenu, just please recognize and acknowledge that actually we're not doing very well. That's the truth of the matter. We're not particularly good at connecting with you because there's just too many things going on in our lives. It's really very hard for us to connect. And we actually ask you for your help, please. Can you actually fight our cause for us? Just help us to become a little bit more focused in our lives. Give us the strength of mind to be able to actually think about these prayers and to connect with you in a way which is meaningful for us and for you. Leman Shmecha, for your name's sake, mean to say that the reason why we're asking you to do this is nothing else other than that we can actually be closer to you. So this is part of the recognition after we've asked for forgiveness and for redemption, is a recognition of our own actual inherent weaknesses in being able to connect with God and the inadequacy of our entire effort at standing up and praying and trying to connect with the infinite force in the universe, and to realize that it's just so hard. And so we actually ask for a little bit of help, which is just fine. Goel Israel, can you please just give me a little bit of a hand that I should get a grip on my life and have a stronger mind and be able to connect with you in a more effective way. Today we move on now to the 8th blessing in the Amidah of the 19 blessings, and that is the blessing for refuah, for a healing. Rafeinu Hashem v'nei rafeh. Heal us, O Lord, and we shall be healed. And we ended, blessed are you, O Lord, who has healed, heals the sick of his people, Israel. In a sense, this is the most visceral and real of all of the blessings, because while it is, we ask in the very first of the personal blessings that we should be of sound mind and not, we shouldn't lose our capacity to grasp and to understand. That is not something which is real for us, because most people, if you have a sound mind, you've never really known what it's like to have lost it, other than the fact that from time to time, we all have senior moments. And you get a little glimpse of what life could be like if you can't remember where you put your keys. But it's something which is distant from us. Similarly, when we feel distant from God and we say, Slach lanu, forgive us because we haven't quite managed to connect with you, and Goel Israel, help us with our inadequacies and with our psychological issues and the things which interfere with our ability to be able to connect with you. All of those are pretty much abstract ideas in our daily experience. But the one thing which is not abstract at all, one thing which is absolutely real in all of our lives, is the notion of illness. Either because one has actually in some form or another experienced it, or because one is afraid that one might experience it. My sister put it beautifully once. She said, you know, the world is divided into two kinds of people, those who are healthy and those who are not, unfortunately not healthy. And the dividing line is very, very significant. If a person is not healthy, it has an enormous, enormous impact on every aspect of their lives. Their lives change. So this is a prayer where more than any other, one actually comes to the realization that our lives are in God's hands, that we are dependent on things, on His grace. Because while there are some illnesses which we can call upon ourselves, you know, if you are silly and you go out and you don't take care of yourself in the cold weather and the rain, you'll get a cold. It might lead to flu. It might even become worse than that. But even coronavirus, by the way, if one is sufficiently careful, you can, and you remain vigilant, you can do your very best to avoid it, and you can be relatively assured that you will avoid it. But there are certain kinds of things which just happen to us out of the blue. I once asked somebody, how are you? And they said to me, well, to the best of my knowledge, I'm okay. But I don't really know, because who knows what's going on down beneath the surface? Who knows what is lurking there, you know, at any moment, not to put the fear in people, but it is a reality, particularly as one gets older and you realize that this machine is not made to last forever, and you know, things go bang in the night. And so I always say, based upon my own experience of, you know, the only real serious illness I've ever had, over 20 years ago when I had a heart attack. And illness is actually a very, very important part of our lives. I say that any person who has been touched by the finger of mortality in some form or another, your life changes. Your sense of perspective of the fragility of life, the sense that your life is genuinely in God's hands, changes forever. And by the way, while one never asks for illness, and one of the things we ask for in the early part of our daily services do not put upon me nisayon, trials. I ask not to be tested in life. I'd much prefer to have an easy ride. But if it's going to happen, and if there is illness, then the effect of that is actually one that brings a person into a much, much more humble state in terms of their own self-awareness and their place in this universe. And it becomes an impetus and an energy to try and recognizing that at any moment, you know, our lives can be cut short. Things can happen that disrupt the ordinary flow of our lives. Becomes an impetus for us to be more urgent in making sure that we do the things that need to be done in our lives, because we just don't know what is around the corner. And that's what I mean by when I use the term having been touched by the finger of mortality. Young people don't have this sense. They're bulletproof. They're going to live forever. They have no sense of this whatsoever. But as we become a little bit older, this realization begins to creep into us. And therefore, our sages wanted to put in a very, very real prayer over here, in which a person recognizing that in many respects our lives are in the hands of God, in regard to not just to the accidents and things which happen very suddenly, but into the illnesses which are brought upon us outside of our own control. Therefore, we have a prayer, Rafa'enu Hashem b'nei Rafeh. By the way, this statement, Rafa'enu Hashem b'nei Rafeh, Hosheinu v'niv Hasheya, is actually a line from the prophet Jeremiah, except for the fact that in Jeremiah, it is in the singular, and in our prayers, it's put into the plural. And that is significant. By the way, one is not permitted to change a verse in the Torah from the singular to the plural. And there's a great big discussion about why this is permitted. And the conclusion is that for the purpose of liturgy, it is permitted. If you're simply translating the verse, you have to translate it accurately for the purpose of learning. But significantly, the sages wanted to put this into the plural, because in this moment when we feel our own vulnerability, we need to at the same time recognize the vulnerability, that we're others around us as well. This is not just about me. Rafa'enu, all of us collectively. It's a collective prayer to the Almighty. Well, there's more to speak about, but we've taken enough time. So we'll come back to this tomorrow. We're looking at some of the language. So we are looking at the eighth blessing, Rafa'enu Hashem v'nei Rafeh. Heal us, O Lord, and we shall be healed. Hoshe'enu v'niv Hasheya. Save us, and we shall be saved. Ki tehillatenu ata, for you are our praise, etc. As I mentioned yesterday, this prayer, of all the prayers, is for real. They're all for real, but this one's for real in a different kind of way, because either you are a person who, God forbid, is suffering from some affliction, and therefore you really want to get better, and therefore this prayer means something to you. Or thank God you're a person who's completely well, and you pray to God that you should continue to be well, because our health is so central to our lives and to the way in which we feel, the way in which we operate. It is something which affects every aspect of our daily lives, and being healthy is something which we care about very, very much. So this prayer therefore puts us in a direct relationship with God in a way which is different to many of the other prayers. As I mentioned yesterday, the first verse over here, Rafa'enu Hashem v'nei Rafeh Hoshe'enu v'niv Hasheya, is actually taken from the book of Jeremiah. It's picked up from the book of Jeremiah, except that we have changed it from the singular, as it is in Jeremiah, to the plural over here. When, as I mentioned yesterday, while this is ordinarily not permitted to read a verse in a tense or in a gender or whatever that changes it, in this instance, for the purpose of liturgy, it's fine. But more importantly, this puts it into the plural, because our prayers for health are not just for ourselves, but for all others around us as well. And by the way, on this point over here, many people, including me, some people believe that you can actually add names of people in this prayer that you're praying for, the Hebrew names. Others say, and this is what I do, that in the course of this prayer, if there are people who are particularly ill and you want to have in mind and you want to pray for, that one would pause in the prayer, just stop and reflect for a moment and bring them to mind. Actually visualize them in your mind and pray for them in a mental way. God can read the thoughts, and as you know, sometimes it's a very extraordinary thing between human beings, that if you think about a person very, very deeply, they are aware of it, they feel it, they know, they feel the closeness. So to pause over here and to think, some people actually stop over here as well, and they think about all the people who are closest to them, their spouses, their parents, or their children, etc., and they just bring them to mind, and pray for their continued good health. So this is a moment in the Amidah, a meditative moment, when a person can actually, connect in a very deep way with people around them, people either who they've been asked to pray for, or those who they're close to. And that's just an idea of the way in which you can make this prayer something even more meaningful. When we start looking at the language of this prayer, there's some really interesting nuances over here. The first one is in this Jeremiah that I've quoted at the beginning of this over here, Rafa'enu Hashem v'nei Rafeh. Heal us, O Lord, and we shall be healed. One of the commentaries, the Eitz Yosef, says, makes a very nice distinction between the first part of this phrase and the latter part. Heal us, O Lord. That's the part, God, that you should do. You heal us. You bring us a refuah. The nerafeh, and we shall be healed, will complete the recovery. If you start the recovery, we'll complete it. In what way will we complete the recovery? As you know, people deal with illnesses in different ways. There's some people for whom illness is so debilitating that they're simply not able to cope with it at all, and it just destroys them as a person. And they live with their illness, caught up in it as if it's encompassed them, enveloped them, and they can't actually move outside of it. An enormously important part of any healing is actually our mental attitude, our own spiritual fortitude, the way in which we actually help HaKadosh Baruch Hu to heal us by our minds. And you'll see people who are either in terrible circumstances, and yet they carry it with such incredible fortitude. Joy, I'm thinking about your mother of blessed memory and many others, that the spirit, the mind, etc. Rafa'enu Hashem, please, Almighty God, we pray to you, please help me, make me up. But I also want to say to you that I'll do my part as in this partnership with you. I will make my spirit and my mind strong. Rafa'enu v'nerafeh, we will prevail over this with a mental attitude that brings us out of this in a way which is stronger. And this will touch upon another beautiful phrase that comes a little bit later in this prayer as well, which we shall look at tomorrow. So we're in the middle of Barech Aleinu Tashana Hazot L'Tova, the 8th blessing, the blessing for material prosperity. And on the last occasion, I explained why this is couched in agricultural terms. But it is actually an exceptionally subtle blessing. And if you look very carefully at the words, it says, Barech Aleinu, bring blessing upon us, L'Tova, for the good. And the word Tova is actually repeated several times in the blessing. What is being got at over here is the idea that this should be for the good. Is the sages put it very beautifully. They said, how can it be that on occasion the vine may offer its fruit and yet wine will be expensive? That doesn't seem to make sense. There's an abundance of crop, and yet when you go to the marketplace, it costs you a fortune. Something has gone wrong somewhere. And what has gone wrong is human mismanagement in the process. Either greed that leads to scarcity or to famine or to oversupply or to mismanagement. The fact that it doesn't filter down to the people themselves, even though there may be a tremendous abundance in the country. Everybody else is getting rich, and yet I'm struggling to make a parnasa. What has gone wrong in the unequal distribution of wealth in the society that leaves some getting rich, richer, and others getting poorer? How come there's such an abundance of food on the shelves of our supermarkets, and yet I somehow don't have enough to be able to keep my family fed? That is what's being alluded to in this blessing over here in a very subtle way. The sages were very alert to this phenomenon. And therefore they're saying to us, Barech Aleinu. Please, the Almighty, there's two parts to this blessing. One is that you should actually bless the earth. That it should be able to produce its abundance. But the other is that human beings should be able to bless us, so that human beings should be able to conduct their affairs in such a way that food is equally distributed throughout society, and therefore, Barech Aleinu, let this blessing come upon us as well, which is a beautiful idea, really, and a very subtle one for the age in which this was written. Let Tova, and let it be for the good, because here's a second idea that they were very much aware of, that sometimes there can be so much good that the result of it is that instead of allowing us to come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to be able to use the freedom which we have from prosperity for good things, instead it corrupts us. So the outcome of it is not l'tova. So we pray that the blessings that you bring to the world should give us the freedom and the ability to be able to do good things with the blessings that we receive from you, rather than simply destroy the world and ourselves because of our own sense of greed and selfishness or corruptness. My father used to put it beautifully, sometimes a person can go completely mad from too much goodness. Goodness is something we pray for. Too much goodness is something which throughout all the ages, human beings have had difficulty being able to manage. We're not always good at managing abundance. Over too much wealth, it can be corrupting. And that is implied over here in the blessing. Yes, we're asking for blessing from God, but we also recognize that there's a human element to this, both in terms of the way in which human beings control the market and also in terms of the way in which I respond to those blessings. And those are some of the ideas that exist within this Barech Aleinu. So there are two more things I'd like to say about our blessing, the eighth blessing on Refuah. The first is that the second phrase of this prayer reads as follows, V'ha'alei refuah shlema l'chol makotenu, which we translate in a very benign way as bring complete recovery for all of our ailments. It's an incorrect translation, because a literal translation is raise up, v'ha'aleh. It doesn't make any sense. How do you raise up a healing? It's a complete mismatch. So the basis of this particular phrase over here is actually a verse in Jeremiah. In chapter 30 of Jeremiah, verse number 17, I will raise up new flesh and I will heal your wounds. And the sages copied this. By the way, in that particular phrase, the word for healing is arucha, not refuah. And in the Ashkenaz liturgy, the sages changed it to the more used and well-known phrase, not the biblical phrase arucha, but the more rabbinic phrase refuah. If you look at the Sephardi prayer, you'll see that actually they talk refuah arucha or rucha refuah. They use actually both of them. But at any rate, this comes from Jeremiah. So the question which you ask as to the mismatch between the idea of lifting up and the idea of healing is a question not to be asked on the authors of the Amidah, but actually on Jeremiah himself. Jeremiah, as you know, actually underwent an enormous amount of suffering. He had a really, really rough life. It's not an easy job being a prophet, certainly not for him at the time. And he suffered an enormous amount of not just difficulty from people around him, but also a lot of illness as well. And perhaps he's actually offering us a very profound insight over here, and one which we would have seen ourselves on many occasions from people who have suffered. And that is that actually sometimes through suffering, there is genuinely a lifting up. The person who has been through it comes out of the other side, in a sense, almost higher, more sensitive, more inspirational. The having survived it, having fought it, brings out from within us the deepest ability, human ability, to be able to withstand suffering and, in a sense, to grow from it. Any person who knows has been through difficulties in their lives will look back at those times and know that they are terrible and that one never asks for it, never ever wants it to come. But having been through it, one has to look at oneself and ask oneself a very honest question. Am I a stronger, bigger person? Am I a person who's managed to sort of lift myself up from the gray of life, having experienced the intensity of black and white? Does that then bring a whole new tonality to my life, a whole depth of feeling, a whole new spiritual sense of depth in myself? Am I a higher person as a result of the suffering that I've been through? And perhaps this is what Jeremiah is trying to allude to over here, that somehow in the Almighty's plan for the world, in which he introduced the idea of illness, and by the way, the first person in the Bible where we find illness is Jacob, around his deathbed, when we send a message to say that he's failing. And apparently Jacob actually prayed to be ill before he died, because it's one of the ways in which you're able to prepare for death in an appropriate way, rather than just dying straight away, as as Judy in particular will know from this conversation. So there is somewhere in God's pattern of illness and of suffering, something that comes out of it in human terms, notwithstanding the fact that we emphasize again and again and again, it is not something which we ask for, or certainly not something which we pray for. So that's the one point, this very unusual expression, v'ha'alei refuah shlema. The second point is that the blessing over here seems a little bit mean, in truth, because we end the prayer by saying, Baruch atah Hashem, Rofei Cholei, may you heal the ill, Amo Israel, of your people Israel. Wouldn't it have been a little better to be a bit more universalistic and to pray for everyone? Why are we being so small-minded over here? Is this the old sort of Jewish thing? Let's just care for our own. By the way, I should point out that a little bit earlier in our prayers, much earlier on, we have in our pre-prayers, so to speak, we have Rofei Chobasar Mafri Lasot, one who heals all flesh and who deals wondrously. So actually, at that point, we do pray for everyone, and then we kind of like narrow it down and over here pray for Israel. It's the same principle that we have over here, you should love your fellow as yourself, which the sages, strictly speaking, interpret as towards our co-religionists. Does that mean that one shouldn't love anybody else? Or does it mean over here that one shouldn't pray for the healing of anybody else? And the answer is not at all. There's no exclusion over here. It doesn't say anywhere, and only Israel, but not anyone else. So of course, there's the opportunity to pray for others who are not of our faith, and to pray for anybody who is ill. That's absolutely clear over here. But the principle over here is always that one feels most strongly for one's own family, for one's own group, etc. And the most intense sense of our honest commitment are to the ones who are closest to us, not exclusively, but that just naturally, that is the way human beings function. And so because we feel ourselves part of Israel and we're engaged in a prayer amongst our fellow Jews, it's perfectly natural that we should be praying for the healing and the health of our group. But I stress again that it doesn't stop anybody in these prayers. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is a prayer in which one can pause. I didn't mention, by the way, yesterday that some people actually have in their Siddur a little post-it with the names of the people that they want to think of during their prayers. And so it's just an aide-memoire, that as you are reading this prayer, you've got in front of you some names, and it helps you to pause and to look at that post-it and to think about those people, to pray for them. And there's no question, of course, that you can include people who are not Jewish as well in that list, because we're turning to the merciful God, and we don't want any human being to suffer. So that is in pretty much the blessing for refuah. And tomorrow we shall take a look at the 9th blessing, which is also an extreme. Okay, today we turn to the 9th blessing. So this forms a trio of personal blessings. We start with inui, which is mental or emotional affliction. We then come to refuah, which is physical health. And then we come to parnasah, which is the ability to actually earn a living and to be sustained in our lives. 3 hugely important elements of our daily lives, therefore grouped together one after the other. And interestingly, of the 3, parnasah is the last one, not the first one. Most people, when you stand up to pray, you're going to put parnasah first, but actually after mental or emotional anguish and refuah, health, it actually is genuinely 3rd place. But so interesting in terms of the way in which this blessing for parnasah has been couched. So let's just very quickly read it. Barech aleinu Hashem Elokeinu et hashana hazot. Bless us, O Lord, for this year. Ve'et kol minei tevuata letova, and all its types of produce for the good. And then you have to insert in the wintertime a blessing for rain, and Sfardim in the summertime a blessing for dew, which Ashkenazim don't. Sorry, in this blessing over here, you do say it, either vatein bracha or vatein talumatar. So you switch from summer to winter, which means at the very least, even if you're not paying attention to your prayers, you do need to know whether it's summer or winter, so you can say the right insert. So grant a blessing or grant dew and rain as a blessing, panei adama, on the face of the earth, v'sabeinu mituvecha, and from your goodness satisfy us, v'varech shanatenu kashanim hatavot, and blessing our year as the best of years, baruch atah Hashem v'varech hashnem, blessed are you, blessed is the year. So this is, in a sense, couched in almost agricultural terms. It's about rain, and it's about types of produce for the good. And one has to ask the question as to why the sages sought to put all of our parnasa in these terms. Well, one very obvious answer is historical, that at the time when the sages in Yavne were composing these prayers, the majority of Jews, certainly in the land of Israel, would have been engaged in agricultural produce or stuff, engaged in some way or another with a form of income that might have been connected to the land, and the importance of the land producing its produce each year, etc., would have been central to the entire agricultural economy, and so therefore it made sense to put this into agricultural terms. But the question really is not satisfactorily answered by that, because over the centuries it is quite clear that we have drifted pretty far away from the land, many of us, and we are engaged in forms of income that seem completely divorced from the land per se. Might it not have been more sensible to have a blessing such as the one that we actually have in the benching in Birkat Hamazon? Harachaman hu farnasenu b'chavod. It's, by the way, it's my favorite part of the benching. I think it's to me, the most significant line in the whole of Birkat Hamazon. Harachaman hu farnasenu b'chavod. Almighty God, merciful God, please give me the ability to earn an income with dignity. To have an undignified means of living is no fun. Dignity is an important part of the way in which we earn our money, earn our ability to sustain our lives. B'chavod, with honor, with dignity. So why not simply put over here, Harachman hu yifanasin b'chavod, or some kind of blessing over here, which would have echoed the idea of parnasa in general terms, rather than strictly agricultural terms. And I venture to say, just a view over here, that in so many ways, the earth itself remains the bedrock of an entire economy. Pretty much everything which we do is going to, in some form or another, even if you're dealing in derivatives, something completely abstract on the share market or whatever it is, the earth, the ability of the earth to sustain us, the ability of the rain to fall, for there to be crops, for there to be an abundance of food, for there to be healthy food, is really the underpinning of everything in our lives. And therefore, to even imagine that we could be so foolish as to divorce ourselves from Mother Earth, from the energy of the earth, from the blessing of rain, from the blessing of the growth of crops, and the blessing of a good and a healthy year, would be a complete and total foolishness. It would disconnect us altogether from the central underpinning role that nature continues to play in our lives, even though on a daily basis in an urban environment, when you wake up in the morning, you dash out of your house, you get into your car, you get caught in a traffic jam, you go into an air-conditioned building, you sit in front of a computer screen, you are so distant, so disassociated from the earth that if somebody asks you, what do the clouds look like today, you wouldn't be able to answer because you forgot to look up and to see them. You didn't even notice your own garden that morning as you rushed out in a hurry. What's the weather forecast today? You're going to take an app, a telephone app, to find out instead of looking out the window or feeling it or sensing it. So the sages never wanted us to be disconnected, I think, from the sense of the connectedness to earth, however urbanized and sophisticated we become in our lives. And of course, today, that will become even more urgent as the issues relating to ecology and to global warming, etc., begin to dominate, and our care for the world begins to dominate. We see the importance of actually remaining connected with it. So that is, in brief terms, my suggestion as to why this blessing is couched in these ways. And once again, we'll start to look at the language from the sense of equilibrium in a person's life, and the recognition about how interrelated some of these issues are. So one would have imagined that the placing of these three blessings, which started off with the issues relating to mental health or affliction, either affliction which comes from the outside through oppression of one form or another, but more important in our age, the affliction, the self-inflicted affliction, which comes from the inside relating to mental state, which is then followed by physical health, a prayer for physical health, refuah, which is then followed by a prayer for parnasah, for sustenance. And you would say, well, okay, that all makes perfectly logical sense, since we were starting with the, one thing that leads to the next, leads to the next. But I think really that the sages had a much, much deeper insight than that. They weren't just putting together things which sounded like they needed to be alongside each other. I think they were trying to tell us something about what it means to, when you pray to God, the sense of well-being that a person has. You wake up in the morning and you're functioning, and we take that for granted. I'm okay. Okay, some days you wake up, feel a bit more tired, the body is kind of like schlepping and dragging a bit. You have to drag yourself to the prayers, drag yourself out of bed. Other days you wake up and you're full of beans and full of energy, and you can absolutely conquer the day, swallow it up. But there is nevertheless in our lives, we do have a sense of well-being, and we tend to forget about the underpinnings of them, what is contributing to that sense of well-being. And really there are three things which are very, very much interlinked. And they are these three things that we've been speaking about in the last three blessings. That if a person is mentally afflicted in some form or another, you're anguished, you're completely thrown off balance. Nothing else kind of like fits in your life. You become obsessed with inside of yourself. You can't climb out of your own little life. And so therefore issues relating to the great blessings of wealth, not necessarily wealth, we don't mean wealth over here, but we mean the fact that we can live in a lovely home, and we can have food on the table. All of that seems to actually have no significance because one is so anguished. Similarly, in relation to physical health, if physical health is not present, as we discussed, it destroys everything. And the sages even understood the interconnection between material prosperity and health. Those who are impoverished, by and large, it impacts upon health. You see that societies or parts of society which are impoverished have lower life expectancy, more health problems of one form or another. Even you see now in the coronavirus that there's a close connection between the one's openness to the virus and one's financial circumstances. You're living more closely together, etc. You don't have proper nutrition. So the sages actually understood that these three things, in our sense of internal well-being, in our minds, in our state of being, and our physical health and our wealth, are all completely and totally interdependent. And when we stand up and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the morning, it's about actually focusing on this and saying, thank God that I am a functioning human being. Thank God that these under these pillars of life that I take for granted here are in place. And therefore, people sometimes will skip over the blessing for refuah shlema because they say, well, I'm feeling well. It's only when you really start to feel ill that you actually really start to pray to God for refuah shlema. You know, you have to, it has to affect you before you actually want to say, please God, help me. No. You need to say it every single day because we can't take it for granted, you know, that we are bodily well. You know, we can't take it for granted that we are in a sound emotional state, you know, that we are functioning human beings. And we certainly should not take for granted the fact that however affluent or non-affluent we are, you know, we remain in the upper percentile, you know, of the most fortunate human beings on this planet compared to the rest of the world. And our sages, you know, prayers are really about, not always about just saying thank you to God. It's actually about our own recognition, sensitizing ourselves, becoming more sensitive, you know, to these our own good fortune. And when you become more sensitive to it, you're more likely to say thank you for it. And so that's the three blessings that we've been looking at. So that finishes that section of there. And tomorrow we move on to the next blessing, which, as I indicated a little bit earlier, takes us into a whole other section as well, which we'll come to tomorrow.